Hey guys, I'm here with Dr. Chuck DeGroat. Chuck, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Greg.
I want to talk about your writing. You've written some very powerful books. You blend theology, psychology, and pastoral experience. When you sit down to write, where does the spark usually begin for you? Is it a story, a question, something stirring in your spirit? Where does that spark to start come from?
I think the spark, there might be a continual spark throughout uh, perhaps the evening, overnight, because I often write in the morning, and oftentimes it'll be in the middle of the night. I'll wake up to use the restroom or something like that, and a line will come into my head or something like that. And it's sometimes as simple as a line or an opening story for a chapter, um, or some sort of illustration or play on words, right? That gets the creative juices going. And I think when you talk to writers in general, and I'm sure you're seeing this right now, um, there's something like that that's always it's a generative process, right? And so there's something I could be in a faculty meeting. I teach at a seminar. I could be in a faculty meeting, sort of zoned out. Don't tell anyone I said that, but playing with some words in my head, playing with the sentence structure of a paragraph or something like that. And so I think that there's probably a constant. It's not one particular spark that comes up at the beginning of a writing process. I think particularly when I'm writing a book, that creativity is it's a pretty generative process throughout, with dips, of course, at different times, but generally there's something moving within throughout the entirety of the process.
Yeah. Now, when you sat down to write, you have written very powerfully about narcissism and narcissism in the church. First off, I have some questions about that, but first off, what was the response when you start writing about narcissism in the church? What kind of, I would say, hate mail do you
Yeah,
get? What was your response?
yeah. Oh, actually, I didn't get much at all. In fact, the response was actually pretty warm and welcoming. I do think that I tried hard to write the book in a way that was balanced. It showed empathy to those who are on the narcissistic spectrum. That wasn't pathologizing, to use language that we like to use in my world, which is to say that the diagnosis is not a death sentence, right? It's to say that the diagnosis is not your deepest reality. It's speaking to a pattern of relating that can be changed or shifted over time. But I'd say on the whole, because of that, what I heard from people, particularly later. I mean, I'm thinking of folks who maybe prejudged the book based on what they thought it was going to be. I've been on some podcasts where some pastors in particular have said to me, number one, I didn't realize that you were a pastor for so long, and that gives you some credibility to write a book like that. Number two, I read the book, and so whatever preconceived notion I had about it sort of dissipated once I read it and I saw that it was balanced. And third, you're more hopeful than I thought you were going to be. And so there have been a few folks, as you might imagine, who there was one pretty sharp critique that I did not use the word sin enough. I thought I was talking about a dynamic that was caught up in, it was clear that I was talking about sin in and through the entirety of the book, but I didn't use that particular word enough. There are critiques like that that weren't as substantive, I don't think, but no, it was a fairly warm welcome to the book.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember being very intrigued when you started writing about what was coming out. When you posted online
Mhm.
what was coming down the pipeline, I thought, man, this is pretty cool because over my years of church staff and being that number two guy, I have
Mhm.
experienced pastors that were on that spectrum, that scale, and
Yeah.
I uh, I'm so glad you you dove into to tough stuff. A lot of writers wrestle with vulnerability,
Yeah.
um, knowing how much of their own story to share. Um, how do you discern what belongs on the page and what belongs in private processing?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Even the word vulnerability, I think, needs a little bit of clarification. What I often say about writing, and my writing in particular, is that I'm open, but I'm not vulnerable. And what I mean by that is this: I save vulnerability for my closest friends. I think when I think of vulnerability, I think of something that I'd share in the moment, perhaps about a really hard conversation my wife and I had last night, or a challenging interaction at work, something in the here and now that still it contains within it some emotion, some pain, maybe some confusion that I need to work out. I think openness, my understanding of openness, that's what I call how I share my writings, is more about stuff that I've processed already. It's been digested and metabolized in and through conversations and journaling and writing and my own internal processing. And it comes out with a particular kind of intentionality, you might say. I mean, I think in the most recent book, Healing What's Within, I shared parts of my story, and there were folks afterwards who said that that was so vulnerable. For me, it didn't feel vulnerable. I mean, when I'm truly vulnerable, it hurts. To sit down with a good friend and to share something. But these were stories that I had processed any number of different times in any number of different ways. And so when it lands on a page at that point, it doesn't feel like as much as at stake. I think the other thing is, I think good writers have good editors, and I think it's my editor more often than not says, give me a little bit more, actually. I think you could stand to be a little bit more vulnerable. You could share a little bit more. And so a lot of people tend to think that I disclose pretty easily, but she's the one who prompts me to offer a little bit more most often.
Yeah. Um, when when you address topics like soul care or emotional formation, things like that, what's the biggest mistake you see other writers making when they address soul care or emotional intelligence, things like that?
The mistake I see other writers making, I I think one big one that I'm aware of is that too many writers write about this without a whole lot of experience doing it over an extended period of time. In the book on narcissism, I thought I had coined a word, but it turns out that others have used it. It's the word vulnerability, F-A-U-X, vulnerability. And I do think that there's this phenomenon where we tend in our therapeutic and psychologized culture to have so much information at our disposal. You scroll through Instagram nowadays, and there's so many trauma-informed accounts. There's information now readily available through AI that people are overnight experts on all sorts of different things, right? And that's my fear is that it's not lived. It's really important to me that what I write has been lived. And the older I get and the grayer I get, the more I have this sense that it's been metabolized within me. When I go back to the first book that I wrote, which was called Leaving Egypt, Finding God in the Wilderness Places, that was in 2010. That was 3 years before I was hospitalized. My body caught up with me with some trauma. I wrote about some things in there that I feel strongly about. I stand by, but I think in some ways the reality is that there was a bit of a contradiction in my own life. I was writing about things that I'd not yet fully processed, I don't think, right? And it took a hospitalization in Mexico. It took a pretty significant health scare, my body being septic in my early 40s, and some significant work I had to do after that to fully metabolize that. And so, yeah, I do think that that's probably the biggest thing that I see. There are probably other things that I'd name as well, but that's the biggest, I suspect.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about you mentioned the word trauma.
Mhm.
For writers who feel called to speak into emotionally charged or sensitive areas like trauma, leadership wounds, spiritual formation, what guidance would you offer as they develop their voice?
Well, number one, it goes back to what we just talked about. I think it's got to be lived first, and so uh, I think maybe even just to continue that conversation for just a moment, there have been a number of books that have come out over the last 5 years by people who experienced abuse in the church and wrote about it pretty quickly after their experience, whether on Substack or in a book. Maybe a Substack went viral and they got a book offer, right? And so I think that's one of the things that I worry about a bit in this space is that it's again, it's not experienced, it's not metabolized, and so um, that's just important to me that the maturation process is as important, if not more important, than the development of your writing. You can take a writing class, you have a good story to tell, but if it doesn't come with your own maturation, and by the way, I've just got done writing a new book that's going to come out in fall 2026 about this, about character and maturation. If it's not accompanied by your own maturation process, I just think it's going to lack substance and depth. As good as your writing might be, um, one of the things that I tie this to in the trauma conversation is where we are from a nervous system standpoint. And the reality here is, and you've probably seen this in your work as well, a lot of us who've been in ministry for a long time have lived in a kind of chronic sympathetic activation, which is to say, a body in fight or flight mode, a body in constant people pleasing and appeasing mode, and that's exhausting. You can be really productive. You can churn out a lot of content from a place like that. But the shift that needs to happen for the sake of maturation, and I think for the sake of good writing, is from sympathetic activation to what I call the ventral home, the ventral vagal system of our nervous system. Our home is this place of safety and connection, and rest and play and creativity. I think from that place, you're going to find your most creative writing. You're going to be connected to your own heart. You're going to be able to talk about your wounds in a way that isn't reactive, but is metabolized. And you're going to be attuned to the needs of your reader rather than sort of writing out of your own unworked out dynamics, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed you posted about your book that is coming out and the word character and
Yeah.
that, like you said, people don't really talk about that much.
Hmm.
Can you take us behind the scenes of your research and writing rhythms, kind of a little bit of your
Yeah.
process, how it the genesis of a book and how it comes to
Yeah.
fruition?
Yeah, it's interesting. This newer book is really is a response to questions that I've gotten about the narcissism work and the big question, how do people change? And when we talk about narcissistic personality disorder, we talk about it being characterological. So the word character is in that word, which is to say it's shaped one's character over time. You've become this grandiose personality, right? And it's the only self you know. It's the only mask you've worn for a long, long time. And so, the book on character, in some ways, came out of that. But when I think about the genesis of it, I mean, it goes way back. It goes back to my earliest days as a pastor. The first preaching series I ever did on the Beatitudes, and some research that I was doing on that, asking myself the question, what does it mean to flourish as a 27, 28-year-old pastor with really little clue about these kinds of things, right? It goes back to early studies of the fruits of the Spirit. But here again, I think um, this is now 25 or more years later, and it's been lived and metabolized in particular kinds of ways, not least in my own body and my own mistakes, my own failures, my own contradictions, right? And so part of the writing, part of the research is one, your own life, your own story. I learned this from Henry Nouwen, Frederick Buechner, folks like that, right? Who Parker Palmer, who as Palmer says, let their life speak. So that's part of the research is, how have I learned this? How have I grown through this? Part of the research on character was going back to some of some of the old. There's been a lot written on character formation. There's stuff that goes back to the early centuries of the church on virtue ethics. There are what have become classic books by folks like N.T. Wright and James K. Smith on character formation, and asking myself the question, would I be so bold as to critique them or to say that they only went so far and there's a little bit more. And I like, for instance, what N.T. Wright and Jamie Smith have to say about character, but I think there's a more fundamental conversation that we need to have about how people change. Um, can I muster up the courage to be able to take what's good and what I appreciate in my research and have the courage to say, but there's more for people who are far brighter than I am on these things, right? And so there's a lot that goes into it, and I think most writers would say that when we're honest, we're really insecure. And there's a little voice and sometimes a not so little voice just over our shoulder that's whispering, you're a phony. No one's going to believe you. No one thinks you're an expert on these things. Your words don't matter. And so then when you hear that voice, that can really stifle the creative process. And so then I've got to put my laptop down and I've got to listen and do my inner work until I get to a place where I'm ready to go again. And so um, people think this whole writing thing is sexy, but as you know, it can be really grueling.
It is. And so you see that a lot of writers struggle with like an imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I think if we're honest with ourselves, and I think most of us who are connected to our own humanity, connected to our wounds, connected to our brokenness, our story, at least try to be honest with ourselves. As you're writing, there, in one sense, there's this the voice is saying, "There's nothing new here." Someone said this before. I felt this a lot. I didn't feel it as much with the narcissism book because I thought I was making a unique contribution. Then when I started writing Healing What's Within, there were a number of books on trauma that had been written. And even though I was approaching it with a unique angle through the questions that God asks in Genesis 3, I had this sense that there are people who are uh, have more expertise on trauma than you do. And there are so many books out on trauma now. What do you have to offer, Chuck? And so I had to do a little bit of work around that voice, knowing that I think what I have to offer is a larger conversation that intersects with Christian spirituality and theology and more. But boy, it's tough when that voice gets really loud in your ear.
Yeah, and I think that's something we all struggle with of
Mhm.
do does there need to be another book in the world that expresses my thoughts, my opinion, my
Yeah,
perspective, my
yeah,
viewpoints? Does the world need that? And
yeah.
am I arrogant thinking the world needs to hear from me?
Yes.
And that's
Yeah.
just that's
Yeah.
something we all wrestle with.
Yeah. I do think, and I wonder, I bet you've experienced some of this too. I mean, as I've been, you and I are old enough to remember a world before social media,
Yeah.
before the proliferation of ideas, right? In the way we see them now, in and through Instagram posts and Substacks and social media. Well, I do think that, and I've talked to some writers who are a little bit older about this. There was a time when I think when we were in our little bubbles, we thought, I think I'm making a genuine contribution. And now when we see that there are so many other experts, so-called experts, or people who appear to be experts, so this performative expertise out there, there's more of an insecurity today or anxiety today for writers, I think, than there might have been even 25 years ago. And so we're dealing with that as well. I remember saying to my publisher before I got the last book contract for Healing What's Within, I don't know at the time I was in my early 50s, I guess. I don't know why you'd sign me when you've got, the 32-year-old woman on Instagram who's a lot better at it, and who's a lot better looking than I am, and is a lot better on Canva, and has very pretty posts, and knows how to do these things, in ways that I don't. Why in the world would you want me to do this, And so I tried to talk them out of signing me to another book deal in the process. And what I'm grateful for, a smaller publisher named Tyndale, is they said, we actually think those of you who are a little bit older and who've lived a little bit longer have something to say. So I was grateful for that.
Now, with all this that we just kind of touched on, what keeps you grounded throughout the creative process?
Well, the grounding has probably been the most important thing since the hospitalization back in 2013, because I think I was going so hard. I was living in what I call chronic sympathetic activation, or chronic sympathetic storm, that I was, my nervous system was in overdrive. I was the prototypically busy pastor, that something significant needed to change. And so there's a lot of work that I did after that, and practices that have sustained over the course of the last 14, almost 15 years, I guess. And so I think that it begins. I mean, if you're familiar with the last book, or anyone who's listening to this is familiar with Within, I use the three questions from Genesis chapter 3. And I listen for that first question all the time that God asks, "Where are you?" And so I want to be present to this conversation. I listened for that question before I signed on with Greg a little bit ago, because I don't want to be somewhere else when I'm being invited to be present with you right here, right now.
Right.
And so the grounding work begins with listening for that question, breathing, getting back into my body. Um, for now, saying, I'm going to put this aside. I'm going to put my phone aside. I'm going to put urgent texts aside. And I'm going to be present to Greg right now, to my writing process, to the client that I'm seeing later on. That's where I'm going to be. This is where I'm going to be right now. Um, so it's listening for that question. It's maybe engaging in some breathing. If I feel particularly activated, let's just say I'm coming off of a hard conversation, I had a conflict with someone. If I'm feeling particularly activated within, I'll probably hit pause on something important. I might not write at that point. I might not have another significant conversation until my nervous system is grounded again.
Mm. Um, I've got just one last question for you.
Yeah.
When you look ahead, what themes or questions do you feel the church most needs writers to explore in the next decade?
Yeah, so I mean, this feels a little bit like a cop out, because I just talked about it a few moments ago, but I really do think it's important. This issue of character is so important to me. Now, there's a larger conversation that I'm not equipped to have, that gets at our collective character, that gets at, the obstacles, the systemic obstacles uh, to the character of a nation, let's say, or the character of leaders, in political spheres and stuff like that. Um, I try in this book to stick to what I know best, and I do think that um, we've got to have this larger conversation on what it means um, to live with a sense of a moral imagination. I wrote recently in a Substack about the reality that there was a time, a lot of us are caught up in some frustration around presidential politics and things. I'm not going to get into politics, by the way, so don't worry about that. But about the character of our presidents, and some will say, I remember a time when a president would be noble and dignified, and but but what I'd say to that too is that was largely appearance too. That was largely performative as well. What we know about the private lives of some of our earlier presidents is that they had some skeletons in their closets too, right? They had some shadows that they hadn't worked out. But what does it look like for us to become people of character without it being performative? or without it being a moral improvement project, just buttoning ourselves up and dressing the part. What does it mean to be transformed from the inside out? And that's where in this new work, I talk a lot about the kind of deep foundational autonomic nervous system shift that needs to take place so that our character is born out of a place of wholeness, of rest, of connection, of safety, rather than out of some sort of efforting that comes when we're in sympathetic activation, sympathetic storm. And that's what I see a lot of in the work that I do. And I know you and I have both been involved in church planning, missional work over the years. In that kind of work, I've seen a lot of men in particular efforting their way to spiritual growth, to church growth, even sabbaticals, even spiritual retreats become efforts at moral improvement, right? And it's exhausting.
It is.
And so I think something fundamental needs to change. And I'd like this book to be a part of that conversation about how deeper transformation takes place.
You touched on something like I could feel uh I could feel it when you said it, the word effort and
Mhm.
how effort comes in. And like you said, you have people who uh the sabbatical doesn't look like a sabbatical. It's
Mm.
it's interesting. When can people find be able to purchase your new book on character? When does that come out?
Yeah, so that'll be next fall 2026. In the meantime, I'll be doing a lot on Substack around it at a Substack that I call Sit with Chuck, which is a little bit of play off of my counseling work. But um, and just yeah, just continuing to tease it out in those places to see kind of how it's resonating. I recognize that a book on character formation is not the sexiest book in the world when there are it seems like there are bigger fish to fry nowadays, but I do think it's pretty foundational.
I think it's very needed. I'm excited about it. So people can find you on your Sit with Chuck Substack, and then
Substack.
where else on social media?
Yeah, I mean, in all the typical places over at X and Instagram and Blue Sky and Threads, and although I think for a lot of us, we're running on fumes in some of those places, and so I'm investing a little bit more in Substack. I was asked to invest a little bit more on Instagram by my publisher a few years ago, so I've worked at that. Um, yeah, I probably am getting to that stage of life and that age where it's like, can I pay someone to do this for me? But still trying.
Now, if our Inc. audience, if they want to start uh, reading your work, what book would you want them to start with if they want to start reading like a first book from you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in some ways, I think uh, even though it's probably the book that has sold the least number of copies, the book Wholeheartedness, Busyness, Exhaustion, and Healing the Divided Self. It was published by a smaller publisher, and so it just didn't get the traction that I think other writings have gotten. But that's um, that's an invitation to this life of wholeheartedness that I'm hinting at without a whole lot of technical psychological language. Um, it's visionary. It's a little bit theological, a little bit poetic, a little bit philosophical here and there, but it's this vision of a life of wholeness. That might be a good place to start. If you are experiencing a spiritually abusive situation or relationship when narcissism comes to church, if you're experiencing some trauma, healing what's within. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Yeah, I appreciate you so much, Greg, and all the things that you're involved in. Thanks for your work.
Awesome.